Hello, world. I'm Keith Tier, and this is Anthony Vancouvering. We're old friends, very old friends. We go back to Siberia Cafe in 1994.
Plus, we're old.
Plus, we're old. We're old and we're friends. Um, and we chatted yesterday about what's happening in Ukraine, and specifically about the request to ICANN to take some actions vis-a-vis Ukraine, which Anthony can explain. And we don't exactly agree, although we do agree about a lot of things. There's some things we disagree about. And we thought, why not do a conversation with the two of us? Because even when we disagree, we're still friends, so we can disagree thoughtfully and without losing friendships. And it might be helpful to other people who are trying to puzzle this through, especially people in the ICANN world who clearly need to puzzle this through. So, Anthony, why don't you start by kind of painting the context here?
So the Ukrainian government sent a letter to ICANN, and they said, please would you block .ru? Because everyone needs to do what they can to stop this aggression. And there was quite a flurry for a day or two of people writing various columns about how this is a terrible idea and it shouldn't happen. And then ICANN said no. And I'm pretty unhappy with the reasons why ICANN said no, and the defenses that were raised and the reasons that were given for why this was a bad idea. So, yeah, I was writing a rant and a screed, and I decided to call Keith up instead of sending something I'd regret, but really I haven't changed my mind about it. So there you go.
So let's talk about it, because clearly, since the Russian invasion, which I think we are aligned in thinking is a terrible thing, and we both support the Ukrainian people's attempts to defeat this invasion. So there's no disagreement there. Since the invasion, various tech companies have taken very different stances. Facebook and YouTube have proactively banned Russian state media from their platforms. On the other hand, some of the crypto exchanges, Coinbase and Binance being the two I'm aware of, have said it would be a restriction on the freedom of ordinary Russians for them to do anything, so they won't. And my understanding of the ICANN situation is that, well, we both go back a long way with ICANN, and people watching this later might not fully know what ICANN is. So why don't we just start by defining terms? Firstly, explain what blocking RU would mean. What is blocking RU?
Well, basically, when you type something into an internet browser, it needs to resolve, meaning something needs to decide what computer to connect you to based on what you put in. And that's why you have domain names, so that you don't have to memorize long numbers. And the control of those domain names is dished out to various entities by an organization called ICANN and IANA. And they basically say, right, when it says .ru at the end, you people are going to be the ones that decide which computer connect with the domain name and .ru that goes to, based on your own records. So it's somewhat decentralized, but at the end of the day, there's a dot at the top, and that is ICANN. And they regularly say, right, you are the designated person or organization to take care of this namespace, or you are. It's not as if they have no role in it. In fact, their role is absolutely critical. So because it's so critical, out of this has come an organization called ICANN, which is a bit of a free-for-all, in that anyone can say what they think at it, but not one at all, because what people say to ICANN is, regularly ignored, as in this case. So basically, an organization that can say, right, Russian government, you are no longer responsible for .ru, and we're going to either not give it to anyone, or we're going to give it to somebody else. And that is blocking.ru.
So the Ukrainian, I think it was the Ukrainian president, if not mistaken, but somebody important in Ukraine asked ICANN and IANA actually
Right.
to take actions which would, in effect, if I'm understanding correctly, cut Russia off from the global internet. And even internally, I would imagine the domain names would not work in browsers and so on.
Well, they might figure that out. I don't think it turns off the internet in Russia. It turns off the resolution of domain names in Russia.
So
But
you'd have
basically,
to,
it's going to screw up your email. Certain sites won't work, et cetera, et cetera.
right.
But connectivity itself is still there.
Now you favor it. So explain why you favor it and how you think ICANN, given its governance, could do it.
Well, the reason I favor it is because, the moment is now. And this is important. And, Europe is being invaded by a murderous fascist dictator with a massive army. And, we've seen this movie before. And so, I'm happy to go through and, in my opinion, destroy the arguments that are being presented as to why this has to happen. But what no one is talking about is the speed at which things need to happen. And so, one of the attractive things of blocking.ru, or not resolving it, or however you want to call it, is that it's immediate. And so that could have an effect. That could do what sanctions do, which is foist pain onto the Russian government and its populace, in the hopes that they will do something that makes Putin stop this crazy murderous war.
So okay, so maybe that's a good segue for me to do my best to put the other side.
All right.
And I'm going to ignore some of the tactical things, like I've read all this commentary saying, well, ICANN is not a decision-making body. It's a kind of a custodian of the internet and has a policy-making processes, and the executive is not empowered, blah, 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 which all strike me as being excuses not to act. So I'm going to avoid going into all that stuff, although I do think ICANN is not set up as a governance body of the internet and doesn't see itself as a governance body. It sees itself as a coordinator. When and this has happened to me twice, with your support, actually, Anthony, when I've, run for president of ICANN, or CEO, I think it is, of ICANN, it was clear to me on both occasions as I was interviewed by the board that understanding ICANN's custodial or non-governmental role was key to being included in the community as being acceptable. So I don't think it sees itself as a government that can make decisions. That said, I take your point. If anything is going to be done, now would be the time to do it. And they do have the technical capability of doing it, as does IANA. So when I take the other side, I'm not going to get into all of that. I'm just going to paint a broader picture about what's going on in Ukraine. And I think where I start is, what do you want the end result to be? I start with that. In other words, what are the goals, short of helping Ukraine and Ukrainian people, which I think I have as well? What are the goals here that are both doable and realistic? And my critique is mainly a critique of US and UK and Western foreign policy and NATO over the last few years, which seems to have the end game of containing Russia, or limiting Russia in some way. I personally don't think Putin is a murderous fascist dictator. I think he's exactly what you'd expect to get in Russia post-Cold War, given the history of that part of the world. I do think he's a nasty piece of work and nobody I would want to hang out with. And I do pray, or I'm not
I
religious.
wonder which word you're quibbling with in murderous fascist dictator, but go on.
You know, he's not a fascist. He's a Russian nationalist. That's true.
Okay.
And
Close.
he's you know,
Distant cousin.
he's a tacit dictator, but he does have to stand in elections, which basically seems like he may have had the ability to fake the results on. But he's very popular there. When I was last in Moscow, I didn't meet that many Russians that didn't like him. So he's extremely popular, but then so is Hitler.
Hitler won an election, you know?
Yeah. So I think he's a Russian, a modern version of a Russian czar. He's nationalist, he's Christian. He wants greater Russia. And I don't think the West has either the desire or the ability to contain him. So and in fact, attempting to contain him simply provokes him. So I think the big question is, how does the West live with Russia? I don't think the question is, how do you defeat Russia? Because I don't think that's doable.
Well, are you suggesting appeasement? I mean, what exactly are you?
I'm exactly suggesting appeasement. I'm
Right.
suggesting that Germany has been really smart up until now in buying gas from Russia, that capitalism should be all over Russia, and that the only way to stop Russia being an aggressive threat is to integrate it into the world, not to seek to defeat it. And any attempt to defeat it probably will lead to World War III.
Well, you look at it from the point of view of NATO, right? And the US foreign policy and EU foreign policy and so on. But I would say to you that regardless of what they are doing, which, you know, is largely around, moving missiles and troops around, the private sector has been flooding Russia with money. And that's why everyone has cell phones and, in many ways, like a Western society.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say that your solution hasn't been tried. It's simply that, an influx of money and trade and so on has certainly not pushed Russia into, something like a family member you can deal with. It seems to have done quite the opposite. You're going to argue that it's NATO that did it, but if
No, it
Putin
takes
Russia,
two.
he's also not very happy with all of the Western influences that he's seeing.
Yeah. No, I don't only blame NATO. I mean, I start with what Russia is. So
Right.
the original sin is what Russia is. Russia is a failed Stalinist state that had a corrupt transition to some ugly form of capitalism that led to oligarchs and a political system which clearly is far short of democracy.
But very Russian. I mean,
And very Russian. So I start there. Now, in that context, I think the continued existence of NATO post-Cold War was an error of judgment on the West part, because by pulling various former Soviet satellites into NATO, this conflict or some conflict was inevitable over some period of time.
I think you were looking at it in very Cold War terms, as if there's no self-determination of these so-called satellites and they're just pawns on a chessboard. The fact is they don't want to be under the Russian yoke or influence or whatever you call it. And the Ukrainians certainly don't. And so to me, it's not what Russia wants. It's what people of the world want and their ability to determine their own fate outside of these chess pieces that you are referring to.
No, I think self-determination is a principle. I don't disagree with that. I would question the idea that the Ukrainians want to be part of NATO, and the recent history of Ukraine is the opposite.
I didn't say they want to be part of NATO. They may now.
I think there are some who do, but when the elected government of Ukraine was overthrown in 2014, it was a pro-Russian, pro-European mix that was understood that it kind of, in order to survive, it had to be a little bit of both. and it was criticized as being too pro-Russian, and the coup was to get rid of the pro-Russianness, which led to the chain of events which led up to Zelensky.
being
And
elected.
yeah, and now I think there's a stronger pro-NATO, and Ukraine, given where it is in the world, and if one was to stand back, and look at the world as a board game, it's very hard for Ukraine to be one thing or the other without upsetting the balance. So,
Yeah, well, who gives a shit about the balance? As long
well,
as this
you
our
can
World
you do if you don't want World War III.
War III, so what? Who's balanced? I mean, I'm not invested in this dumb balance.
But
I'm invested.
are you invested in are you invested in a stable world that Russia is a part of?
Yes.
So how do you achieve that?
Well, I think that is something I'm interested in, but that's not the only thing I'm interested in. I'm more interested in a world that's fairer and more just, even if the fucking Russians are unhappy. As long as they don't start raining bombs on us, they can lump it. They don't get to go around and shell people next door because they're feeling threatened or unappreciated or no one sent them chocolates and flowers, Hell with
But
them.
I think, okay, I'm going to accuse you of being a little bit ahistorical there. I mean, if you think about any great power, and you're born here in the States, I'm born in the UK, we both could, if we were asked, give a long list of brutal military expeditions that our countries led against weaker people around them, that were disgusting in the extreme.
Right.
So Russia is not exceptional; it's normal.
I think that what you're doing is taking really bad behavior and calling it normal because other people did it and saying, therefore, we shouldn't mind if Russia does it too. And I reject that.
I don't think I'm with you on that. I reject it. I also reject what our governments did,
Yeah.
but I don't think we have a moral high ground as a society. As you and me personally probably do, because we probably didn't like it when our governments did it either. But what I'm saying is, Putin and, let's say, George Bush the first and the second, at the level of morality, it's hard to say one is better than the other.
They're products of, how can I put it? They're products of the same ecosystem, if not of the same exact systems.
Yeah.
And
And we probably now, would we have asked ICANN to block the American internet when it invaded Iraq?
I didn't.
Right.
How's that?
So,
Listen, if ICANN were to say, hey, we're invested in world stability, and so we've decided that the best way forward is to give a little here and to give a little there, and yes, we have to hold our nose and deal with murderous fascist invading dictators, and that's what we do because our job is to make sure the internet doesn't fall apart. That's not what they say.
yeah.
Here are their arguments. Number one, turning off .ru will only hurt ordinary Russian citizens. Really? How did you figure that out? Are you like, have you done an assessment of like who it will hurt? I have a feeling it would hurt Putin too. And if you look at all the sanctions and all the business decisions that are being made, many of them hurt ordinary Russian citizens. They're being done anyway because they hurt Putin too. And they want it. The West and the rest of the world, frankly, is saying we want as much leverage as possible so that Putin stops doing what he's doing. So I don't buy that at all. I think that is the laziest excuse I've ever heard. Another one is, oh, this will upset the internet governance structures that are out there. And this seems to be the stronger argument. Hey, look, we've, carefully cobbled together this working relationship between governments and civil society and businesses. And there's this multi-stakeholder approach. And not everyone's happy all the time, but at least everyone gets to put their input in. And you know, you would seek to destroy that, you know? And that's a little like saying, "Hey, Ukraine, we hear you're being bombed. In fact, we're watching it every day. It's on great TV, by the way. Um, you know, we'd love to help you. We really would, but we can't because if we come out against a murderous, invading, fascist dictator with a massive army, well, who can trust us in the future? We've taken sides." And I don't
Yeah.
buy that either, because if you are only going to deal with people who will deal with you if you don't protest murder happening in front of you, maybe you should rethink about who you're dealing with. And maybe the one world, one internet, which doesn't exist anyway, by the way, is really not something that you should plant your flag soil you should plant your flag so firmly in. Maybe it should be one internet for free peoples instead of just, one internet for some people who are that way and others who are just, basically disassembling the internet in their own country anyway, which is what Russia's doing by blocking this and blocking that. So you're not really, if IANA can't be listened to or trusted because it's come out against someone bombing children, then they really need to think about what trust means.
Well, I think there is a broader problem. I actually agree with most of your technical things, which could they do it? I mean, ICANN is a private corporation, so it can do whatever it wants.
Not only that, they delegate top level domains on a regular basis
Yeah.
for
So,
not
so,
fantastic reasons.
so they definitely could do whatever they want.
Yeah.
But the framework I think of it in is this. I actually think that nationalism is the core problem here. In this particular case, Russian nationalism. But I think nationalisms in general have led to all kinds of conflicts all over the place. And what you call murderous is a word we could use for many, many different situations. Sometimes not dictatorial murderousness either, sometimes democratic murderousness.
Well, I think you have to be careful not to not ignore scale when you talk about principles, because yes, lots of countries do murderous things. In fact, I
Right.
think you can't actually win the Nobel Peace Prize without having killed somebody, it seems.
So,
but there's a difference between a full-scale invasion of a country with, a lot of artillery and a lot of civilian casualties and huge humanitarian disasters and something like blowing up the Greenpeace boat.
right.
The French did.
Now, but that said, I think of ICANN, and this may be idealistic on my part, but I think of ICANN as being in the same list of experiments in a supranational framework that I also think of the UN in that context, and the World Bank and the IMF in some ways in those contexts, which is asking the question, is it possible for the human race to do stuff that is just good for the human race, independently of nation state self-interest? And, the rules governing the world's airspace, the international air traffic control system.
Antarctica. There are many examples.
Lots of examples. And I'm kind of biased in this because I think that nation states in the 21st century are roughly equivalent to what Florence was prior to the formation of Italy, which is historical relics that don't really serve humanity anymore, but we can't get rid of them. And in order to get rid of them, it would take, a revolutionary transformation, which isn't going to happen anytime soon. But I do see nation states as the source of the problem. And I almost don't want ICANN to listen to any nation state. I want it to figure out what's right and what's wrong all by itself.
Okay, great. Fine. They should listen to the local internet community. That's this phrase that's embedded in ICANN's history. It was first used in RFC 1591. It talks about service to the local internet community. Now, ICANN has brought in this other concept called the global internet community, which seems innocuous enough. But, that all sounds fine and well. But I think you have to ask yourself, these institutions that are supranational, that hold out hope of a post-national future for humanity, are supposed to do something. They're not just supposed to exist. They're
Yeah.
supposed to exist for good,
Yeah.
And
I mean, the Italian state was only formed because, remind me of the leader of the Italian
Garibaldi.
because Garibaldi took up arms against the little self-interested states called Florence and so on. And so, it is correct that you can't imagine a post-national future where nationalism becomes ancient unless somebody takes a stand for something global.
Right. And by the way, today, the only alternative to a nation is an empire. And that is what Russia is seeking to reconstruct, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But certainly whether they call it all Russia or whether it's a bunch of cooperating satellites, it amounts to the same thing. So
yeah, I don't see there's any difference between the invasion of Ukraine and the Soviet invasion of Hungary or Czechoslovakia. It's part of the same pattern of events.
right. The difference is that the Ukrainians had a little bit of warning and are fighting back.
Well, the Hungarians fought back. They had a revolution, but it failed. But they tried.
It failed very quickly too.
Yeah. And so I'm totally with you that the right thing to do here is to try to defeat the Russian invasion. And I think I'm probably okay if ICANN did something to help make that happen. Although I do think the internet helps the opponents of Russia, even inside Russia. And I have been struck, actually surprised, by how much dissent there is inside Russia and how much of it's getting out through various digital means.
I agree with you, but I don't think that that's necessarily having to do with domain name resolution. There's a lot of the internet now that is outside of that.
Well, I don't know. When you code a mobile app, you're still using the DNS somewhere to route packets.
Right. I mean, well, good. I mean, in the end, I don't think look, if ICANN does or doesn't block .ru, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. What got me going were the mealy-mouthed reasons for them not doing something, To me, if the government of Switzerland and BP and Shell Oil, the latter two losing billions of dollars by pulling out, if all of these companies and governments who are known to have been extremely weaselly in the past about such issues are doing this, even at their cost, one wonders, well, if even the Swiss aren't neutral anymore, why is ICANN? Why are they striving to promote this false equivalence between nations?
Yeah. What do you think there isn't a reasonable argument to be made? ICANN didn't make this, but it feels to me like this would be a reasonable argument. That assuming that the goal is to do everything you can to undermine the Russian invasion, leaving the internet on is the better option. That you would undermine the invasion more by leaving it on in Russia than by turning it off.
Well, I think they kind of made that. That's sort of it would only hurt Russian citizens idea. It's like, the pain is not worth the reward. Besides, that's not how all this whole thing works. It's kind of.
Yeah, that felt to me more like, poor little Misha wouldn't be able to get on her Instagram or his.
I think it's more like needlessly penalizing people who had nothing to do with this decision.
Yeah. Whereas I'm more saying the opposite. I'm more saying a stronger version of that, which is giving people the tools to dissent?
Well, they can hardly organize anything. So, I mean, the idea of them actually being in charge of managing help seems ridiculous. But
Yeah,
uh, they, you see individual registrars saying, "Hey, we're not going to register .ru names," and so on.
yeah,
There's a lot of things that people are willing to do, like, I don't know, not have official Russian government people on working groups or so on, and that's all well and good, just has absolutely no effect.
yeah,
Zero, none. Nobody cares. And so it's effectively saying we will do nothing.
yeah. I find myself, I must admit, I mean, I'm quite conflicted because on the one hand, I want the Ukrainians to win as fast as possible. I fear they won't. I suspect that that part of the world is going to become a fairly ugly place for the next few years. I hope it isn't true, but I'm not optimistic. I think the West has made clear they're not going to do anything to stop Putin unless he goes into NATO countries.
Right.
And even then, between you and me, I think the fear of World War III would be enough to make them think twice even about that. So,
I agree with that too. So I think the fear of World War III, that's real. I
yeah,
mean, you and I grew up hiding under desks when we were school children, so we know. That's a real threat, and that needs to be taken seriously. However, the threat of internet governance structures, having to, have a spine and say no to murderous dictators doesn't strike me as World War III. That strikes me as a slight inconvenience for people who are very, happy
yeah.
with how things are.
So, I mean, the way I think of it is, that, and this is how I resolve it for myself. I think there's actually three sides. There's Russia,
Right.
there's NATO,
Yep.
and there's the Ukrainian people. I am unambiguously pro the Ukrainian people and anything that can be done up to and including sending weapons to them and so on, uh,
Yep.
and blocking if things that they will find helpful for their cause. All good. I don't want that to be interpreted as me supporting the NATO alliance because I think the NATO alliance is an out of date, you know, group of rapacious colonial and imperial countries themselves.
Right.
Um, so I think ICANN would be in a very strong position to represent itself as neither NATO nor Russia, but people.
And
And if it
not if
would
they
have
then
done
say,
that, I would have.
if they then say, and therefore we're not going to help you, though, that
No, that's what I'm saying. Then I think there's a really strong case for them helping. But then they got to figure out that they really are helping, not making it worse. But um,
in a way, I'm the other thing I want to that sort of got under my skin was what I consider a little bit the suicidal actions you know, of people who are saying, "Hey, we shouldn't interfere." And a lot of them are people I really love and know and respect. And I'm a little surprised to find myself on the other side of an issue with them. But to me, what this invasion means is that the world order is going to be recast, and China is in that mix too. They're
yeah,
staying on the side, but things are going to change, and political will has already changed, and that is going to, you know, come on into the internet and into internet governance. It's going to be everything from uh, freedom of speech issues to internet governance structures, the role of governments in them, the moral content of contributions, as well as uh, just the sort of technical side of it or the bureaucratic side of it. And to me, if you support a free and open internet, then you ought to support it now because no one's going to take you seriously later if you hem and haw. And
oh, yeah,
let me give you an example of what this looks like, right? In a few weeks or a few months or a year or whatever it takes, that Russian juggernaut is going to control Ukraine. And, you know, then apparently the local internet community, namely Ukrainians, can complain about how to ICANN about how they're not, they're not allowed to run their own namespace. But until they're actually murdered, they have no standing. So the Ukrainians can't say, hey, these troops are pouring over the border. .ua is threatened. That's the Ukrainian top level domain. Our internet community is threatened. You guys are supposed to listen to that, and that should be your determination on how things are run, or at least a good part of it. And ICANN's basically saying, yeah, I get it, but right now you're still running it. So until they actually shoot down the door and kill you, you have no standing to complain about it. And then after that, we'll go to a lot of conferences and wring our hands and say how unfortunate it was.
Well, your point about redrawing the map of the world, I think, is a constant. In my life,
point surely.
So in our lifetime, it's been redrawn once in a major way, from the UK to the US being dominant.
Right.
The 50s and the 60s were, if you think about almost every conflict in the world, where the US and UK were not fighting each other, but what was really happening was the transition of power, whether it was the Mossadegh regime in Iran handing over to the Shah, whether it was the Shah and the Ayatollah, whether it was Nasser and Pan-Arabism, whether it was the formation of Israel. Almost every conflict, the UK and the US were transitioning world power from the UK to the US. And,
right.
and everything was kind of a proxy for that. Well, today, I think the transition from the US to China is the overarching umbrella of the next 100 years is that transition. And almost every conflict, including this one, you can see that larger story being played out through it. The people involved in the direct conflict are merely pawns in the game, just as Germany and Poland was really about the US and the UK. And the US, cleverly, as the future winner, stayed on the sidelines until everyone else was exhausted and then picked up the pieces. China probably will do the same here. In other words, stay out of it because there's no interest in getting involved.
Right.
And the exhaustion of the world in conflicts will lead to an acceleration of China's supremacy at a moment where the US is economically speaking, at least, in decline.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and if the trouble with that kind of argument, it begins to ascribe things like cleverness to nations. Like U.S. cleverly stayed out of the war. I don't think Roosevelt had any intention of staying out of the war. He just had political realities at home to deal with. So, but I think there's a countervailing force here in world history, and that is the necessity of people in the world to get together to fight the destruction of the world's climate. And that is a big, big change that's never been faced before. And it runs right against a lot of economic interests and a lot of what I call statist interests, in the sense that states like to have things in ways that they know how to control them, because that's what they do. And so this idea that somehow China is going to be, ruling the world, and that's just another cycle in the world cycle of different, et cetera, ignores the fact that people are waking up to the fact that there's not going to be a lot of world to rule. And so when faced with survival, people act. And we are not quite there yet, but that is coming.
Yeah.
At an accelerating pace. And so I think that there's this countervailing thing to me, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the snuffing out of Ukrainian self-determination is a direct assault on our ability to survive the climate crisis, because it's going to take the people of the world to change it. It's not going to be nations who do it.
Yeah. Well, it's as backward looking as the building up of NATO. Both of them are symbols of a bygone era that is not relevant to the future.
Correct. And people play with the tools they have at their disposal. So Putin is also a complete slave of that worldview, and that's why he wants to reconstitute a strong Russia. He wants to keep the sort of the soft Cold War going because it gives Russia a heightened position in the world. Without NATO, what would he complain about?
Yeah. Well, I think we're seeing this broadly, aren't we? Where Trump represented this kind of thinking, which is a throwback, and to some extent, Brexit, which there's many cases. There's a strong case for Brexit because the EU was undemocratic, but the idea that the UK represents a future organizing body for people is a throwback, and so
charitable.
Even though Europe probably isn't better, it's worse because it's undemocratic. So I can get that, but what I struggle with is how do we humans get beyond these nation states to a prize that we can all feel and see because we travel, which is we're all the same living on one planet with a common set of problems. How do we ever get there if national interest, supersedes human interest?
Well, what you do is you take supranational organizations like ICANN and you enunciate a set of principles that are human and humanitarian in nature, right? And you follow them. So, all this stuff about preserving internet governance structures is, I'm not like, they're okay, but they're not up to the moment. They involve long negotiations with, bodies like the Government Advisory Committee, who can only speak with unanimity and therefore, have to go and consult the most retrograde members that they have. And ICANN can't move until they move. And the whole thing is a creaking bureaucracy that is, in many ways beholden to retrograde interests.
This is a pretty strong argument for what is broadly being called Web3 and distributed autonomous organizations, where it's a little bit too technical for this conversation, but basically the technology already exists where the stakeholders of ICANN, were they to leverage this technology, could decide in an hour what the right course of action was, and then implement it through something called a smart contract. So basically, the routers that run the internet would have software triggered on them by decisions that were made, very quickly by everyone that was empowered to make those decisions.
Right. Well, ICANN got rid of that a while ago when they said, right, sorry, voting public. They used to vote for people for the vote of directors. People who wanted to vote could vote. And lo and behold, people who were motivated to vote did vote, and those who weren't didn't. And the results weren't what ICANN liked. And so they got rid of the democratic element of ICANN. Yeah. And now they have all these structures which they have a good side in that they tend to bring in people who have expertise in the area, but they have a bad side, which is that they only bring in people that they like. And so the whole thing is a closed system.
So who was basically I call it the Platonic system. So ICANN is philosopher kings as depicted in Plato's Republic. Wise people who, get to make decisions because they're better than the rest of us. And they're not really accountable in any way. What was it? Socrates who was more the demos person? You're a student of Greek history.
No, Socrates did not like the demos. He was the philosopher king kind of guy.
Who was the demos?
Not really anyone among that actually came. I mean, the Athenians had democracy, and but they saw it as they saw the bad side of that as, tyranny of the stupid.
So I think what you need to argue for, Anton, now we've had this conversation, is you need to argue for the Web3 blockchain-based new version of ICANN, where decisions are made bottoms up by the stakeholders and are implemented through software immediately.
I utterly disagree with that. There's no way. There's no way I would recommend humanitarian impulses being filtered through somebody's hardware and software. That sounds like a recipe for capture to me.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how you get rid of top-down bureaucracy, which is what you're saying exists now.
Well, you get rid of it the usual way you get rid of it, which is that, the world changes so much that the emperor is seen to have no clothes and everyone goes crazy and says, right, we have to redo this again. I mean, I remember when ICANN was being formed, and that's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they don't show a huge deal of willingness to reform from within. And I'm not just speaking about this issue, but generally. And so at some point, it won't be tolerable anymore. And a lot of good things will go down with the bad.
So let's give you the last word. What message do you want to send to all of your colleagues in the ICANN ecosystem?
That while you may have wise heads, you have short memories. There is a guy with a really big army with a lot of tanks and a lot of nuclear weapons throwing their weight around, and they're killing innocent civilians. And you're talking about your precious internet governance structures, and you're talking nonsense about hurting Russian civilians as if that has anything to do with it. And if you want an open internet, you need to fight for it. And the time to fight for it is now. And if you want not to block.ru, you've got to come up with better reasons than you did. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you for this 47-minute conversation, and hope to be seen somewhere by you in the next few days. I'll send you the